Have you ever wondered why there are certain things about women that no one ever talks about? Not in movies, not in books, not in relationships, and definitely not in honest conversations between men. Because the version of female nature you were taught is not the full story. It's not the sweet, romantic, polished narrative that society repeats over and over. Beneath that surface lies something deeper, more instinctive, and far less comfortable to face. This isn't the kind of truth people casually discuss. In fact, most would rather you never hear it. Because once you understand it, once you truly see it, there's no way to unsee it. Carl Jung knew this better than anyone. While the world kept trying to understand women through clichés, superficial advice, and wishful thinking, Jung went straight to the unconscious, straight to the symbolic forces, straight into the archetypes that operate far below the surface, the part of the psyche that neither logic nor politeness can access. And what he uncovered wasn't comfortable, it wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't something anyone wanted to accept. Because when you peel back the layers of female psychology, not the conscious persona, but the unconscious drives that operate beneath it, you find patterns that most women would never consciously admit. Not because they're bad, not because they're manipulative, but because they're unconscious, automatic, and deeply woven into the fabric of human nature. Every man who's ever felt blindsided by mixed signals, who's experienced sudden warmth followed by cold distance, who's been pulled close only to be pushed away, who's sensed control disguised as vulnerability or softness that masks something sharper underneath, knows this confusion isn't random. It's not a mistake. It's not chaos. It's a psychological pattern, one written deep inside the unconscious mind, a pattern that exists whether anyone likes it or not. And here's the cruel irony. This pattern isn't just hidden from you. It's hidden from them too. The conscious mind doesn't control it. Social conditioning doesn't erase it. It operates automatically, silently, beneath the surface of every interaction, every attraction, every rejection. And that's why it feels so maddening, so confusing. Because you're not fighting logic. You're facing something far older, far deeper, and far more instinctive than logic could ever touch. This video isn't about blaming women. It's not about turning frustration into resentment. It's about understanding, real understanding, psychological clarity, the kind of clarity that most men are never given. Because the world teaches you to ignore this, to pretend it doesn't exist, to believe that what's happening is always accidental, emotional, or personal. When in reality, it's none of those things. It's archetypal. It's structural. It's part of the shadow side of human nature, the part that Jung spent his life studying. So if you think you're ready to see what women don't want you to see, if you're prepared to confront the uncomfortable psychological truth that most men never figure out, then take a deep breath. Because once you cross this line, once you see what's beneath the surface, nothing about the way you look at women, relationships, attraction, or even yourself will ever be the same again. When Carl Jung began to explore the unconscious, he quickly realized that human behavior isn't shaped by random experiences or pure rationality. Beneath every thought, every reaction, every attraction, and every rejection lies something far older, something deeper. A set of invisible patterns called archetypes. These aren't just ideas or labels. They're ancient psychological forces that shape how every human being operates, whether they know it or not. And when it comes to female psychology, one truth stands out above all. What's conscious is only the tip of the iceberg. Everything else, the impulses, the instincts, the emotional strategies, the hidden motives, lives below the surface. It lives in the unconscious. It lives in the archetypes. Jung discovered that every woman, just like every man, carries multiple archetypal forces inside. Some are light, nurturing, and conscious, but others are shadow forces, hidden, disowned, operating quietly behind every interaction, every smile, every withdrawal, every moment of warmth followed by distance. These forces aren't malicious. They aren't about manipulation. They're biological, psychological, and evolutionary, operating exactly as they were designed to. And the cruel reality is this: most men never learn how to recognize them. They spend their lives confused by mixed signals, blindsided by sudden shifts in behavior, and wounded by emotional games they don't even understand are happening. Not because women are intentionally doing it, but because even women themselves aren't fully conscious of these patterns. Let's start with one of the most powerful yet invisible archetypes, the Anima Shadow. In Jungian psychology, the anima is the inner feminine, the emotional, relational, intuitive side of the psyche. But in women, the anima also has a shadow, a side that isn't nurturing, soft, or gentle. It's the part that tests, the part that withholds, the part that triggers insecurity, confusion, and craving in those around her without even realizing it. When a woman engages this shadow, it's often not a choice. It's an instinct, an automatic psychological strategy to filter, assess, and evaluate the masculine energy that approaches her. The withdrawal after intimacy, the sudden distance after affection, the warmth that flips into coldness. None of it is random. It's an unconscious system designed to create tension, because tension is where psychological power is negotiated. Jung understood this perfectly. He saw that beneath the conscious mind is a battleground of archetypes fighting for dominance. And unless you understand these forces, unless you recognize them, you're not participating in the interaction. You're being moved by it, played by it. Not because anyone is trying to deceive you, but because the unconscious doesn't care about fairness. It cares about survival. It cares about power. It cares about fulfilling psychological needs, whether the conscious mind agrees or not. And this is why so many men fall into the same cycles over and over. You meet someone. There's warmth, connection, intimacy, vulnerability. And just when you start to relax, just when you let your guard down, something shifts. A wall goes up, distance appears, communication slows, and you're left wondering, what did I do wrong? The answer is often, nothing. You didn't do anything wrong. You simply collided with the unconscious, the part of female psychology that most people never talk about, the part that tests, that withdraws, that creates scarcity, not to hurt you, but because scarcity is how the unconscious measures value. If something is always available, it loses status in the psychological economy. If it's unpredictable, if it's slightly out of reach, the psyche assigns it more importance. This is why women, whether they realize it or not, instinctively create cycles of approach and withdrawal, of closeness followed by distance, of openness followed by sudden coldness. It's not cruelty. It's not a game. It's an ancient survival strategy encoded into the unconscious, long before logic, morality, or modern relationships existed. And here's where the harshest truth comes in. If you don't understand this, you become its victim. You become the man who chases when you should have stayed still, who overextends when you should have withdrawn, who explains, apologizes, and negotiates with forces that were never conscious to begin with. But when you do understand it, when you see the pattern, when you name it, everything changes. The confusion dissolves. The self-doubt evaporates. Because now you're no longer being dragged by the unconscious. You're seeing it, observing it, navigating it with clarity. This isn't about control. It's not about manipulation. It's about understanding the psychological reality that has always been there and using that understanding to stop betraying yourself in the name of confusion, craving, or emotional chaos. Because the moment you step out of unconscious reaction is the moment you reclaim your autonomy. And the moment you stop being controlled by the invisible forces you didn't even know were shaping your relationships is the moment you finally step into real psychological power. If there's one thing Jung's work makes painfully clear, it's this. The unconscious doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about fairness, kindness, or politeness. It operates according to forces far older than civilization, older than society, older than anything your logical mind can comprehend. These forces are primal, relentless, and whether you understand them or not, they shape every relationship you enter, especially the ones that matter most. One of the most powerful and least understood forces in female psychology is the unconscious game of scarcity. This isn't a conscious decision. It's not some manipulative plot thought out over coffee with friends. It's a biological, psychological pattern that runs so deep that most women don't even know they're doing it. And yet, it controls the entire dynamic of attraction, commitment, desire, and emotional power. Here's how it works. The unconscious mind, both male and female, is constantly scanning for value. But the criteria it uses isn't based on who's the nicest, the most available, or the most emotionally open. It's based on who carries the most perceived psychological value. And whether we like it or not, value is intimately tied to scarcity. What is always available loses value. What is slightly out of reach becomes magnetic. This isn't manipulation. It's ancient biology. The unconscious has learned through tens of thousands of years of human evolution that anything too easy to get is probably either low quality, desperate, or unsafe. And anything that requires effort, uncertainty, or risk sends a signal. This is valuable. This is worth pursuing. This has power. Women, whether consciously or not, are masters of this dynamic. Not because they're trying to be, but because female psychology, for survival reasons, had to develop this. For most of human history, choosing the wrong mate wasn't an inconvenience. It was life or death. It was the difference between survival or starvation, protection or vulnerability, thriving or being discarded. This is why you'll often see the same pattern repeat itself over and over in modern relationships. A man meets a woman. Things start beautifully. There's connection, intimacy, laughter, openness. Then something shifts. A little bit of distance, a slight withdrawal, a delayed reply, less availability, more ambiguity. You start questioning yourself. Did I do something wrong? Is she losing interest? Should I fix this? And that's exactly where the unconscious dynamic snaps shut like a trap. The moment you begin chasing, explaining, negotiating, or proving your value, you have already lost the frame. Because you've stepped out of your own center, your grounded sovereign self, and into reactive pursuit. And the female unconscious reads that signal instantly. This is no longer scarce. This is now chasing. This is now lower value. Not because she's evil, not because she's playing games, but because the psychological system she's running, the one every human runs, interprets neediness as weakness and scarcity as power. What makes this dynamic especially brutal is that it's invisible to the logical mind. On the surface, the excuses sound benign. I've been busy. I just need space. I'm figuring things out. And maybe all of those are partly true. But beneath those words is a deeper pattern, a psychological dance of tension, release, closeness, withdrawal. And the man who doesn't understand this finds himself utterly confused, destabilized, and often humiliated without ever knowing why. Jung would call this the shadow side of the anima dynamic, the feminine archetype as it manifests in the unconscious of both men and women. In its light form, the anima is nurturing, inspiring, connecting. In its shadow, it becomes elusive, withholding, and unpredictable. It tests not with malice, but as a way of filtering what energy deserves access. And here's the uncomfortable truth that most men never hear. The moment you try to fix it, you validate the test. You confirm the frame that you are chasing something that's slipping away, and the more you chase, the further it slips. This is why men who are overly available, overly accommodating, or emotionally desperate often experience the most brutal forms of rejection, not despite their efforts, but because of them. The unconscious doesn't reward consistency the way the conscious mind does. It rewards tension. It rewards uncertainty. It rewards the person who can hold their center, who can remain grounded in their own value, regardless of whether the other person is leaning in or pulling away. And this creates a paradox that most men never solve. The more you try to secure the connection, the more unstable it becomes. The more you try to fix her withdrawal, the colder it gets. The more you try to win her back, the more invisible you feel. Why? Because the unconscious isn't looking for someone who negotiates for value. It's looking for someone who embodies value, someone who doesn't flinch in the face of distance, someone whose worth isn't contingent on constant reassurance, validation, or approval. Jung would argue that this is the ultimate individuation task for the masculine psyche, to step out of the reactive loops dictated by the shadow feminine and into a sovereign relationship with self. Because the truth is, the Anima Shadow has no power over the man who no longer abandons himself in pursuit of external validation. When a man stops chasing, stops explaining, stops proving, everything changes. Suddenly, the power dynamic collapses. The withdrawal loses its leverage. The ambiguity no longer creates tension because he's no longer holding his self-worth hostage to whether someone else offers closeness or distance. And here's the final piece of the pattern that almost no one talks about. The moment you detach from the outcome, the script flips. The same energy that once withdrew starts leaning in. The same coldness starts warming up. Not because you manipulated anything, but because the psychological economy of scarcity and value has recalibrated. What was once seen as abundant, and therefore disposable, is now experienced as rare. And rare things command attention, respect, desire. But this isn't a trick. It's not a tactic. It's a transformation. Because the man who plays this game consciously isn't pretending to be scarce. He is scarce, not because he withholds love, not because he punishes with silence, but because his life, his purpose, his self-respect are so full, so rich, so complete, that no one person, no matter how beautiful, no matter how magnetic, gets to determine his worth. That's the moment when you step out of the unconscious game. When you stop being the pawn moved by instincts you don't understand and start becoming the player. Not in a manipulative sense, but in the deepest psychological sense. The man who knows the rules of the unconscious is no longer controlled by them. The deeper you go into the unconscious, the more brutal the realization becomes. The confusion you've experienced wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. The same patterns of attraction, withdrawal, hot and cold, emotional volatility, and unpredictable closeness aren't random behaviors. They are unconscious strategies deeply embedded into the fabric of human psychology especially in how the feminine and masculine energies interact. Carl Jung's entire body of work points to one undeniable truth. When something isn't owned consciously, it doesn't disappear. It simply gets projected. Projection is the unconscious mind's way of offloading what it cannot or will not face within itself. And nowhere is this more obvious, more devastating, and more misunderstood than in the dynamics between men and women. When a man meets a woman, he isn't just meeting her. He's meeting the sum total of every archetype, every unmet emotional need, every suppressed desire, and every unhealed wound she's carrying, just as she's meeting his. But here's the brutal twist. Neither of them is consciously aware of what they're actually interacting with. This is why women often unconsciously project aspects of their own shadow, the parts of themselves they reject, fear, or suppress, onto the men they date. It's not conscious malice. It's the psyche's way of offloading its own unresolved material onto an external figure, so it can interact with it safely, without having to face it internally. For example, a woman who carries an internal narrative of men always leave, unconsciously recreates scenarios that prove this story true. She tests. She withdraws. She creates emotional distance just to confirm that he will indeed leave. And if the man reacts by chasing, pleading, or overcompensating, it validates her internal narrative. The psyche feels safe because reality now mirrors the unconscious script. But it doesn't stop there. Jung's work on the shadow shows us that the qualities we most reject in ourselves are the ones we most aggressively project onto others. When a woman feels disconnected from her own aggression, selfishness, or desire for control, it often gets projected onto the masculine. Suddenly, he's the selfish one. He's the one being cold, distant, cruel. The truth? She's interacting with the disowned parts of her own psyche, but externally, it looks like his failure. The reverse is equally true. When a man refuses to integrate his own neediness, his own insecurity, or his own lack of self-worth, it doesn't go away. Instead, it becomes an obsessive focus on the woman's approval. His entire emotional regulation becomes outsourced to whether she's warm or distant, close or withdrawn. His identity becomes dependent on whether she's offering validation at that moment or not. This is where the trap tightens. Both parties are no longer interacting as two conscious individuals. They're interacting as two unconscious psyches projecting their unmet needs, their fears, and their shadows onto each other, creating a storm of emotional chaos neither fully understands. Jung warned that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is exactly what plays out in these dynamics. People don't recognize that the suffering, the rejection, the patterns that repeat over and over aren't random accidents. They are the direct result of the unconscious being ignored, the shadow being disowned, and projection taking its place. And here's where things become brutally clear. As long as you are outsourcing your self-worth, your identity, and your emotional stability to someone else, especially someone operating from their own unconscious patterns, you are trapped. You are no longer living. You are reacting to their withdrawal, their validation, their distance, their approval, their silence. The irony is that the more you chase validation from someone caught in their own projection, the more they withdraw. The more desperate you become for their warmth, the colder they get. And this isn't because they hate you. It's because your neediness activates their unconscious defense mechanisms, the same way their withdrawal activates yours. This is the toxic loop Jung described repeatedly. Two people, both operating from the unconscious, locked in a silent war of projections neither of them knows is happening. It's not about who's good or bad. It's not about morality. It's about psychological mechanics. The unconscious doesn't care about fairness. It only cares about maintaining its own survival strategies. And here's the cruel paradox. The moment you try to fix the other person, the moment you try to soothe their withdrawal, close the gap, make them feel safe, or prove your worth, you fall deeper into the projection trap. Why? Because the unconscious reads that behavior as confirmation of the narrative it already believes. I am the one who chooses. You are the one who chases. It confirms the frame, the hierarchy, the imbalance. This is why Jung's solution wasn't to fix the other person. It was to withdraw your projections, to retrieve the energy you've placed in the other, to stop negotiating with shadows and start dealing with reality, the reality of your own psyche. When you stop making their approval your oxygen, everything shifts. The game collapses. Suddenly, their withdrawal loses power. Their ambiguity stops feeling like life or death. Their silence no longer controls your emotional state, because you've taken back the parts of yourself you were outsourcing to them. But here's the secret. No one tells you. The moment you do this, the moment you stop needing them to resolve your insecurity, something strange happens. Their behavior often changes. The withdrawal fades. The tension dissolves. The push-pull dynamic stops. Why? Because the unconscious no longer feels the need to create tension when the other person isn't playing the role anymore. And this is where true psychological freedom begins. Not because you manipulated anyone, not because you played games better, but because you exited the game entirely. You stopped making your self-worth dependent on someone else's unconscious patterns. You stopped living in reaction to their shadow. You stopped treating their approval like survival. This is individuation. This is what Jung meant by psychological wholeness, reclaiming the parts of yourself that you've scattered across other people. And the cruel truth is, as long as you are trying to resolve your childhood wounds, your unmet needs, or your sense of worth through someone else, especially someone who is running from their own shadow, the pain never ends. But the moment you stop, the moment you withdraw the projection, the storm goes silent, the chaos dissolves, and in its place you find something stronger than approval, stronger than validation, stronger than desire. You find yourself. The self that never needed chasing, proving, or begging. The self that was whole all along, but forgotten in the game of unconscious dynamics. Once you begin to truly see the unconscious dynamics at play, the push-pull, the withdrawal, the mixed signals, the sudden shifts from warmth to coldness, there's no going back. You realize this was never about words, never about logic, never about what anyone said. It was always about energy, about power, about the invisible negotiation happening beneath every interaction. Carl Jung's work makes one thing absolutely clear. The unconscious controls anyone who refuses to face it. Until you recognize and integrate the patterns that have been running your life, you are not choosing your reality. You are being dragged through it, reacting, overcompensating, trying to fix what was never about you in the first place. And this is where most men get stuck. They believe that if they just find the right words, the right gesture, the right moment to prove their worth, the dynamic will change. But it never does, because the unconscious doesn't respond to logic. It responds to energy shifts. And the only way to change that energy is to stop participating in the dynamic that keeps draining you. This is what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the moment you stop outsourcing your self-worth. The moment you stop negotiating your value based on someone else's emotional availability. The moment you realize that their withdrawal, their distance, their tests are not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of the unconscious game itself. And here's the harsh reality. As long as you react to the withdrawal with chasing, as long as you respond to ambiguity with over-explanation, as long as you treat their mixed signals as something that needs to be solved, you are locked inside the frame. You are playing a game you cannot win. Because the moment you play, you confirm the frame that says, I am the one waiting to be chosen. But when you stop, when you genuinely stop, everything changes. You are no longer the one waiting. You are no longer the one asking. You are no longer the one whose emotional stability depends on their proximity, their warmth, or their affection. You step out of the system entirely. And here's the paradox most men never realize. The moment you stop chasing, they start leaning in. The same withdrawal that once felt like abandonment now feels irrelevant. The same ambiguity that once tortured you now feels boring. Because you've stopped feeding the system. You've stepped out of unconscious reaction and into conscious creation. The psychological economy flips instantly. What was once perceived as abundant, because you were always available, always validating, always accommodating, now becomes scarce. And in the psyche, scarcity equals value. Not because you're pretending to be busy, not because you're playing games, but because you genuinely stopped placing your life, your purpose, and your emotional stability in the hands of someone else's approval. This isn't detachment in the fake surface-level way people talk about. It's not pretending you don't care. It's not acting cold or aloof. It's something far more powerful. It's the realization that your attention is your currency. Your presence is your value. Your emotional availability is a gift, one that isn't given just because someone smiles at you, shows temporary affection, or offers breadcrumbs of attention. And this is where the game dies. Because when a man reclaims his attention, when he realizes that it's the most valuable thing he owns, the dynamic collapses, the tension disappears, the scarcity dissolves, because the source of that tension was never the other person. It was the energy of pursuit, of needing, of outsourcing power. This is individuation. This is the very heart of Jung's work. The process of becoming a whole individual, not by erasing desire, not by becoming emotionless, but by withdrawing the projections you've scattered onto others. By taking back the parts of yourself you tried to outsource through craving, chasing, and over-explaining. And it's not just about romantic dynamics. This shift ripples into everything: your career, your friendships, your purpose. Because the man who no longer hands out his attention like cheap candy, the man who treats his focus, his presence, and his emotional availability as sacred, becomes untouchable. Not because he's cold, but because he's full of self, full of purpose, full of clarity. The same energy that once begged to be chosen now becomes the energy that others orbit around. The same presence that once felt invisible now becomes magnetic, not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. And here's the secret. The unconscious doesn't want you to realize. When you stop feeding the game falls apart. The tests stop. The withdrawal loses power. The coldness becomes irrelevant. Because the unconscious strategy only works when it meets reactivity. No reaction, no game. At this point, you stop asking questions like, why did she pull away? Or, what does this mixed signal mean? Because you understand that it doesn't matter. It's noise. It's irrelevant to a man whose center is no longer for sale. And something else happens. Something few men ever experience. The relationships that used to feel like psychological warfare suddenly become peaceful. The emotional roller coaster disappears. You no longer mistake chaos for connection. You no longer confuse tension for intimacy. You start relating to women, Not from need, but from choice. Not from craving, but from overflow. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. This is the real exit from the unconscious game, the moment where attraction, connection, and desire stop being battles for validation and start becoming expressions of mutual respect, mutual choice, and genuine alignment. The truth is, not every person deserves your presence. Not every person earns access to your energy. And when you finally internalize this, not as a theory, but as a lived experience, the world rearranges itself around you. People feel it. They sense it, because it's rare. And in a world addicted to validation, the man who no longer needs it becomes the most magnetic person in any room. This is the ultimate inversion of the frame. Not because you fought harder, not because you became more clever, but because you exited the need to play at all. Once you fully understand how the unconscious game operates, you realize something most people will never grasp in their lifetime. Freedom was never about the other person. Freedom was always about yourself. The moment you stopped trying to decode someone else's withdrawal, the moment you stopped negotiating your worth through their mixed signals, the moment you stopped waiting for their validation to feel seen, chosen, or valuable, that was the moment the invisible chains broke, not because they stopped playing the game, but because you stopped playing it. Completely. And here's the cruel truth the world never teaches you. As long as your worth is conditional on how someone treats you, how close or distant they are, how quickly they reply, how much they affirm you, you are not free. You are trapped in an invisible psychological cage designed not by them, but by your own unconscious agreement to the game. Carl Jung's entire philosophy revolves around this one brutal fact. Whatever you don't own within yourself owns you. If you don't own your need for validation, it controls you. If you don't own your craving for closeness, it enslaves you. If you don't own your fear of abandonment, it dictates every word you say, every text you send, every moment of overthinking, every spiral of self-doubt that keeps you hostage to someone else's emotional availability. And listen, if this is hitting you deeply right now, and you know you're stuck in this loop but don't know how to get out, check the ebook I've left in the pinned comment. It's a practical daily guide designed exactly to help you break these unconscious patterns and reconnect with your psychological power. Simple. Director. No fluff. Go check it out. It's in the comments. Now back to it. Here's the most disturbing part. The person whose approval you crave the most is often the person least capable of giving it. Not because they're bad, not because they hate you, but because their own unconscious is running the exact same game. Their withdrawal isn't about you, it's about their own inability to stay present with intimacy, with vulnerability, with the risk of being fully seen. And once you see this, everything changes. You stop personalizing what was never personal. You stop thinking their distance means you're not enough. You stop translating their silence into your own unworthiness. Because now you understand. Their nervous system, their trauma, their shadow, their unconscious dynamics were never yours to carry, never yours to solve, never yours to fix. Jung called this the individuation process, the sacred journey of withdrawing every projection, reclaiming every fragment of your soul that you scattered onto others, and finally realizing, I was never incomplete. I was only fragmented. And the moment you gather those fragments back, the moment you stop outsourcing your identity to someone else's acceptance, you become whole, not perfect, not untouchable, but sovereign, grounded, complete. The chaos stops. The noise stops. The roller coaster ends. Because there's nothing left to chase. Nothing left to prove. Nothing left to beg for. And here's the irony. The same people who once tested you, withdrew from you, destabilized you, often start leaning back in. Not because you manipulated them, not because you played some clever psychological trick, but because psychological power always attracts. Always. A person who no longer needs becomes the rarest energy in the world. Someone who doesn't flinch in the face of absence. Someone whose worth remains unmoved by silence. Someone who doesn't crumble when others withdraw love, approval, or attention. That person becomes magnetic, not because they demand respect, but because they embody it. But this isn't about getting them back. This isn't about flipping the script so they chase you. That's just another version of the same game. This is about exiting the game entirely, about realizing that you were never meant to fight for someone else's recognition. You were never meant to hustle for love. You were never meant to convince anyone to choose you. Because the moment you choose yourself, fully, radically, unapologetically, you become untouchable. Not because you've become hard or closed, but because you've become whole. And wholeness cannot be negotiated. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be destabilized by someone else's confusion, distance, or chaos. This is the end of the unconscious game. This is psychological freedom. Not freedom from desire, not freedom from connection, but freedom from the addiction to being chosen. Freedom from the obsession with proving. Freedom from the illusion that your value lives in someone else's nervous system. And this is the cruelest and most liberating truth you will ever learn. When you stop chasing what was never designed to complete you, the thing you were chasing loses all power over you. That's when the storm ends. That's when the anxiety dissolves. That's when the loops finally break. And what's left is you, the real you, the self that doesn't beg, the self that doesn't negotiate, the self that doesn't compromise its worth for a crumb of approval. This is the power that Jung tried to teach. This is the real meaning of individuation. And this is the freedom that no one can ever take away from you again. The cruel truth is, the moment you stop needing them is the moment they realize they were the ones who needed you all along.